For decades, clinical psychology operated on the assumption that low self-esteem was the foundational cause of depression, anxiety, and behavioral dysfunction. The standard response was to focus on raising that level, but modern longitudinal data suggests a different driver of psychological distress. The pathology appears to lie less in the specific level of self-esteem a patient possesses and more in the ego-driven pursuit of it. This shift centers on external contingencies of self-worth. This is a framework where an individual's value is predicated on outside signals like physical appearance, gaining peer approval, or outdoing others in competition. Attempting to treat distress by inflating these externally contingent sources of worth often backfires. It reinforces a behavioral trap, making the subject's stability more dependent on the very outside validation that created the vulnerability. The pursuit of this validation, especially within digital environments, may systematically alter the brain's reward architecture. This occurs within the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, a circuit extending from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. This pathway processes reward through two separate modes: a chronic, stabilizing baseline signal and an acute, volatile burst signal. The central thesis is that external validation targets the same volatile burst signaling used by addictive drugs. This creates a reliance on acute spikes, potentially at the expense of the neurobiological systems that maintain stable social rewards. In 2002, Dr. Jennifer Crocker initiated a longitudinal study tracking the behavioral trajectories of 642 college freshmen to see how their sources of self-worth impacted their health. Crocker categorized the students into those with internal contingencies, such as virtue or faith, and those with external contingencies, such as appearance or academic competition. These external contingencies are fragile by nature. To maintain a sense of safety, students in this group required constant validation from outside sources, often on a daily basis. The study monitored specific negative outcomes, including aggressive hostility, increased substance use, and symptoms of disordered eating. External contingencies strongly correlated with behavioral issues. Students staking worth on appearance and competition showed the highest rates of aggression and drug use. Conversely, basing self-worth on internal contingencies like virtue acted as a negative predictor for these same pathologies. Staking self-worth on external validation serves as a predictive catalyst for psychosocial degradation. It creates a reliance on maladaptive coping mechanisms when that validation is threatened. In the digital era, social media platforms are optimized to exploit this psychological fragility, industrializing the mechanisms of external validation. This optimization utilizes B.F. Skinner's concept of operant conditioning. Specifically, it employs intermittent reinforcement, providing randomized rewards to drive compulsive behavior. Likes, comments, and shares function as randomized intermittent reinforcers. This creates a high-frequency validation loop that mirrors the physical reality of the operant conditioning labs. A 2025 study by Jane and Salim examined 500 adolescents to measure how this digital architecture impacts emotional regulation. The researchers found that frequent digital validation seeking strongly correlates with clinical anxiety, depression, and low frustration tolerance. Heavy users frequently exhibited identity diffusion. In this state, the boundary between the real-world self and the curated digital persona becomes porous in the constant pursuit of external affirmation. Digital platforms function as operant conditioning chambers, converting the psychological need for approval into a measurable behavioral addiction. To find the electrochemical reason for this addiction, we have to look at how dopamine functions at the microscopic level. In 2025, Erickson and colleagues used in vivo virometry to measure real-time dopamine release in the brains of mice. The study focused on the dual system of dopamine, the distinction between tonic firing and phasic firing. Tonic firing is the brain's background state. It is a steady, low-frequency wave at approximately 5 Hz that activates high-affinity D2 receptors. Phasic firing represents the acute response system. These are sharp, high-frequency bursts reaching up to 100 Hz, which activate low-affinity D1 receptors. Phasic D1 spikes drive incentive salience and associative learning. These are the same mechanisms that lock in cocaine addiction and digital validation loops. Conversely, the tonic D2 baseline is associated with steady motivational states and genuine social interaction. It has been shown to inhibit frantic drug-seeking behavior. This scatterplot shows the reaction of male mice administered cocaine after a social preference test. The data reveals a negative correlation. Mice with the highest preference for genuine social interaction exhibited a significantly blunted phasic dopamine response to the cocaine stimulus. The data also showed that higher engagement in novel social interaction positively correlated with higher levels of baseline tonic dopamine. Addictive behaviors parasitize the volatile phasic D1 pathway. In contrast, genuine social motivation builds a robust tonic D2 baseline, providing a physical layer of insulation against addictive stimuli. These three datasets suggest that human behavior operates on a spectrum between two distinct neurobiological feedback loops. The external validation loop triggers erratic phasic dopamine bursts. This reliance on external contingencies leads to high anxiety, identity-diffused behavioral states. The intrinsic social loop is supported by a steady tonic dopamine baseline, leading to behavioral stability and resilience. The external loop is neurochemically exhaustive. It requires exponentially more validation to achieve the same feeling of safety over time. This chronic pursuit of external validation functions as a structural reprogramming of the reward architecture, prioritizing immediate, volatile spikes over long-term satisfaction. Escaping this paradox requires a shift in the orientation of our psychological goals. Crocker's hypothesis suggests moving away from the self-focused pursuit of validation in favor of other-directed contribution. Shifting from getting approval toward creating and giving removes the individual from competitive, zero-sum frameworks. This psychological shift links directly to the cellular data. Genuine, non-contingent connection is the mechanism that builds the protective tonic dopamine baseline in the brain. Cultivating intrinsic, other-directed behavior provides a neurobiological buffer, blunting the destructive impact of the modern validation economy.